Hello and welcome to the Heads and Volleys podcast with me, Lee Dunn. Happy New Year! What a great way to start the year with this episode of Heads and Volleys, and it comes from a tweet I put out a little while ago now, and it was asking coaches, and here it is word for word, that how do you get the technical work into your practices? Do you isolate? Do you coach it for the first part of a small-sided game? Do you expect players to be proficient already? Or do you remind players through tactical work? And the reason I ask this question is because I feel like a traditional approach or debate of unopposed versus opposed is kind of consideration for technical training versus tactical training. But I'm interested to know, or I was interested to know, how people approach this technical development of players. Because I've noticed from the games I coached where I will see certain players are really skillful on the ball or really comfortable with the ball and other players are not. And so that leads me to question myself in terms of the way I'm delivering my sessions. And I'll kind of touch on that as I go through the categories of approaches here, but also just in terms of wondering how people are doing it and if they feel like it's a success or if it's just something that they've always done so they continue to do so, or if it's something that's mandated to them through a club, and just to see if there's a trend out there or if there's someone that has suddenly blown it out of the water. And I think I'll introduce to you at the end my overall approach, and I think the approach that will suit everything. But I was just genuinely interested in the Twitter universe and see what people do. Of course, people love to share their opinions, and here I am joining everybody in. So I'll tag everybody in. I'll comment on them throughout this podcast as to who they are and the comments that they submitted. And I've categorized them into four overall areas that it seems that coaches are trending within, and I'll get into that shortly. But first of all, just a huge thank you to Tactical Pad again for their continued sponsorship. The software is so good that I was in a Twitter discussion the other day and somebody asked for some feedback on what the session that they had just ran was like based on the video. And so it was, what do you think and what would you do? And so I give my opinion, and then I say, this is what I would do here. And of course, it's completely out of context because I don't know the players, I don't know the level, and it's a very short video. But with Tactical Pad, I can show other coaches what I would do. And instead of explaining and typing, it's a 10-second video that I created, and it just makes so much more sense. And I know my players really appreciate the same thing too. And of course, with Soccer Innovations also and their tactics board, it just ties it together perfectly because the players can move the dots, the players can be themselves on the field, and we can start exploring areas of the field because I have the full-size soccer field on there. So here we go, getting into the introduction and implementation of technical work into everybody's practice. I'm going to start this first section with what I would call a classic style. It's the idea of moving through a general phase of a practice from a warm-up into some sort of game, finishing with a game. First comment is from Jonny D, Coach Jonny D, and he says that he tries to squeeze it into the arrival activity as much as possible. The first player that arrives is shooting on the goal, and I'm there working with them to improve it in some way, and then the same if two players arrive early and are passing to one another. So he's talking about working individually with the players as they're arriving, and especially in those early parts of the session. So then add in Drew Campbell too, FC Drew Campbell. He has a routine practice design, which is 15 minutes of free play, followed by 20 minutes of technical, unopposed scaling into highly opposed practice, with 25 minutes of some sort of possession game, which he highlights as managing space, and then 30 minutes of a positional game. So there's that traditional kind of approach of working through skill introductions and warm-ups into kind of more gameplay on from there. So I'm interested with Drew there, and I didn't ask the question, but wonder what it's like with the free play. And of course, it's difficult for any coach to stand back and watch free play happen without feeling like they should be coaching, or perhaps parents are watching, wondering what they're paying this coach all this money for. for if they are just spending 15 minutes of free play, but how much of that is used to set up for the future part of the session. So knowing that after 15 minutes, they're moving into some sort of technical focus. I wonder if Drew and if you are listening and do the same sort of approach too after free play, you're connecting the two. So are you saying, oh, watch that passing? Or if you're just completely quiet and not really saying anything. Emily McMillan, Coach M, she works with ages 9 through 12, and every session starts with 15 to 20 minutes of ball mastery, and then it's footwork followed into opposed games. So the thing I really like about this session, much like Drew with the free play idea, is that early players are playing World Cup. So I know I would be at practice first if there was World Cup going on, and a club I used to coach for, I would do the same thing. There were up to 10 teams on the 2 turf fields right next to each other. So my players that arrived early would always play World Cup or Cuppies. So those players were soon sprinting across the parking lot and across the 2 fields to find me in the corner whilst everybody else was trudging along. So it's a nice little secret there to getting your players out and playing early. So there's a theme there with the free play idea. And then, as Emily said, moving into the ball mastery. So they're working on some of the skills that they're playing within the game anyway. And I really like the idea that both Drew and Emily have of just playing the game and giving them something excited about. Count Zero, he mentions that in working with U11s, it's 5 minutes of small-sided games with teams of 4. So my understanding of this is that it's a 2-team game, and then there are 2 teams not on the field, and so those 2 teams are working through foot skills with another coach on the side of the field. So you mentioned that he only has an hour for practice, which I think is a really important factor when you know that you can kind of double stack. So there's a game going on, so players are working through one aspect of the training plan, and then on the other side, if you have this awesome assistant coach that is having your players work through foot skills, then awesome. Now my challenge on that is, what happens if you don't have an assistant? How do you manage that? Because you know the soon as you turn your back on the players, man, they're going wild. So that's an interesting one as well. I think it's really valuable to manage your space and your environment in such a way that you can maximize for these players. Rhiann Harkins mentioned that having to keep technical work within the practice for many reasons, but it's usually done for about 20 to 30 minutes up front of the session, so the start of the session in this classic approach. And the idea of using small-sided games as 1v1s and 2v2s to actually work on that. So not only is it moving from this kind of unopposed idea, but the idea of developing technical skills or improving the technical demand on players in game realistic situations. And so my challenge on that is, if you're doing 1v1s, how long does the 1v1 last for? And the reason I ask it that way is, if it's a quick fire, dribble in, beat a player, score a goal, then now we're talking real terms of soccer. And if you look at any game of soccer, a 1v1 lasts for a matter of seconds. And sometimes it might be up to 5 seconds with prolonged pressure or shielding of the ball. But for the most part, it's find the 1v1, beat or break or lose in the 1v1, and then it's over straight away. So I wonder on that level, Ria, how you're doing with the timings on 1v1s. And then my man, Byron Gutierrez, he mentions using the start of the session, so the first 10 minutes for technical work after warming up. So it works on specifics for receiving and passing styles using both feet, whether it's a driven pass or a floated pass, or how to play with the weak foot especially. And then he mentioned that this year is changing it up. So moving from this kind of specific area of passing and receiving into more of dribbling and playing 1v1s. So I asked why, and he mentioned that he feels like it's more important right now for his players to be more comfortable on the 1v1 dribble. And the idea of it being challenged more in games, that the passing and moving is one element, but actually facing up and playing in those 1v1s, pretty much like we just said there with Rhiann, that how realistic is it to your game, and realizing that after analysis or even just observations of your players, if you recognize that 1v1s are struggling, then that's really going to be an area of focus for you. So he mentioned that there's always going to be a continuous focus on weak foot passing, but that's going to be done more within the flow of the game. Then I've got Lewis Vaughan. He mentions that in working with U9s, the sessions are split into unopposed and opposed practices. So there's always done it that way. And this is kind of where the idea of this classic approach has come from, and that I've outlined here, that feels it allows him to get the technical info in with lots of repetitions for practice. So then I asked, and I ask this of everybody, how are you linking this unopposed to the opposed? So if you've worked on some sort of skills, and he gave an example for shooting. So he works through some sort of technical shooting practice, and some of the sticklers out there may say it is opposed anyway, even if he's declared it as an unopposed practice. And you'll say it's opposed because as a goalkeeper, otherwise is it really realistic that you're shooting? But there are all sorts of games that you can play, or isolated skill practices that you can have for developing the technique of shooting. And then it's followed by 2v1s with plenty of shooting opportunities, which to me makes sense. And that's a logical session progression if you're following this traditional classic approach of here is the skill, here's how we connect it to what we've been struggling with in a game, or what I think we're going to struggle with, or how it's going to help us within our game model. And now we're going to go and use that skill as many times as possible. And if you go through US Soccer's module of coaching, one of the questions that you can ask yourself is it game-like, and are there repetitions? So are there repetitions on the area of focus? So there's a very constant point here of how realistic is it, and are you giving good quality repetition? So like the 1v1s, are they quick? Are they realistic with pressure coming from all sorts of directions? Because often in the game, the pressure can be coming from behind you or from on your side, and a lot of it can be determined on your first touch. So if a player takes a good first touch, does the defender hold off, or do they still charge in? Because if a player takes a good first touch, if a player's charging, they're significantly easier to beat. So many small details that go into this kind of general classification of unopposed practices. And then to answer the question or my query of how you're connecting the two, a couple of gentlemen here that I've added in as what I would call classic plus. And the reason I identify it that way is because there is a clear method to the madness of what they're delivering, the structure of their session, the way they're delivering it, and the connection. So start with Coach Joe. Coaching U12, typically start with unopposed technical warm-ups leading into the main theme of the session. And some sessions may start with light pressure, but technical points are always pulled through. Even during small-sided games, technical flaws should not be ignored. And I really like that comment, and it's a really strong line. I think it's something that I would think that everybody is acting on, but just to repeat, it's even during small-sided games, technical flaws should not be ignored. And as a coach educator and often performing coach observations, often, and you'll know when this is happening because you may be guilty of it yourself, or you hear it on the field next to you, but you hear the favorite English word of unlucky. Unlucky. Oh, that was unlucky. That was the touch just got away from you. Unlucky. Or the pass was the good idea, but unlucky that it didn't get there. These are very typically technical flaws. Was the pass driven, or was the first touch good enough? And was the shot good enough? That unlucky should never really be a factor in the way that you are playing. Unlucky might be that the ball has bounced on a divot and gone into the goal over the goalkeeper's foot, but it's not really unlucky that I tried to make a pass and it was intercepted or it didn't get to its target. So really getting into the technical flaws in your core theme of your practice, which you've worked through in those unopposed warm-ups. So nice stuff there, Joe. Darren Jones mentions to have very short unopposed exercise with elements of the topic inside it. So small-sided games that will include the first exercise and then add more technical detail. So much like Coach Joe says there of having this ideal technical warm-up, and then your small-sided game really focuses in on that. And then Darren also expands on it that the games with overloads and coaching on the focus players and units, then you reduce the overloads and it becomes more of a free playing game. And my understanding on that, and perhaps yours is too, that the overloads on for the coaching on the focus players is that if you're really connecting all of it, your original unopposed exercises will be on an element of those focus players. So it might be their movement, it might be the way that they're receiving the ball to connect another line or to break a line. So then finding a way to isolate that, if you believe in this unopposed style, then taking it into the game and be able to say, do you remember 5 minutes ago when we were working on X? now here it is in the real situation, and having the patience with the players to work through it. And then my main man, Mr. Paddy, he mentions that within his club, Kusa, they run a 4-part session, which is a rondo warm-up for 20 minutes, then some sort of technical skill development activity for 20. That also encompasses all types of activity because they always do a rondo. So it'd be about beating someone, then passing and receiving. So moving from that rondo into that skill development of playing in some sort of, sounds like more of an opposed environment, but it's still the technical ability of how to do so. Then it's positional games and finishing with training games. And so he mentions that the training games alternate every other session between a small-sided game, which is often conditioned, and then into kind of free play. So it always varies between the day of practice. But a constant for them is that the first, the third, and the fourth activities mirror the day's topic. So it's always a constant, that there is a constant theme. And the idea of saying to your players, you know, if you listen to me enough now, you read my material, I like answers. I like the players to have answers. If they're arriving and they are being told straight away, this is today's focus, or this is part of our model, or this is part of our practice, then it's very easy for them to get on board and for them to understand what's going on. So for these guys, I class them as this classic plus because as I said, there's more method to the madness. There's a better understanding or a more clear and concise understanding of how to progress this idea of unopposed or technical approach into this condensed small-sided game, free play approach where there is still a constant theme that it's not just we're going to work on passing and now we're going to go and work on 2v2 and beating a player into the space. I knew that this category would happen. Of course, it's always going to happen. And these are the guys that I called on the fence, and not for any discount of their education or their experience or the quality of the coaching, but they make some really good points. And I think that the first one is Jason Collinsworth, and he makes a point that if you truly believe in the technical side, it will be a part of every activity you do. So whether it's a specific focus or an indirect focus, it's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate. I think this is a really interesting point from Jason because he identifies it as a technique, and sometimes, and especially in some of the earlier comments, there's a confusion or maybe a blurring of the lines between a unopposed practice and a technical development practice, because you can work through an unopposed practice and play 11 versus 0 and work on what we call the old school way of shadow play. So that can be an unopposed practice of building out patterns or ways of breaking through mannequins or cone lines or what have you that's still unopposed. And so really identifying that this technical side is something that if you truly believe in it, and what my understanding on that, and I'll have him criticize me if he doesn't agree, but the idea of it being something that is a foundation for you, and it's a foundation for everything. But I think for me personally as a coach, I have an expectation on players to be able to play or to have his technical ability. So for me, it's a constant of saying you need to be better, or you should be better, or what have we talked about here? And then I think if you were to go on the side of truly believing it, that would be something that you may pull a player out of the practice from and talk to them about, or give them some sort of rerun or some sort of recreation so that you are really hammering on that technical ability. Same with Glenn Alper, It also depends on how committed the team is, the annual schedule, starting point of players, how well you know them, the motivation levels of players, how willing they are to practice at home, and general expectations, how long practices are, how many trainings per week. And he just hits on so many good questions that you have to understand your environment. And if you have taken my online course, you will see there's a lot of focus on your actual environment. So really understanding, and not a lot of people do this, so I encourage you to do it right now. Write down what your environment is. How much space do you have? How many players do you have consistently at practice? All of those questions that Glenn has asked there, and I'll repeat them again, that how committed your team is, an annual schedule, the starting point of the players and how well you know them, the motivation levels of the players, and are they willing to practice at home? Then put all that together And you will begin to identify the true needs of your players, much as I said earlier with Rhiannon, the 1 hour of practice, now recognizing that you actually need to change your practice style a little bit more just to suit the demands of the environment. And then I've got Colton, Matthew, and John, who all replied with very similar comments about how it needs to be relative to the ages and the level of players that you're working with. So I called them the on the fence guys, but I think they're completely right that there's not a one size fits all. And I definitely don't mean to find that answer here. And if I did, I would have sold it for lots of money. But what I really think is important is just having this understanding and overview of what your environment is and what your players need. Are they in a culture or an environment where they are playing street soccer regularly? Well, then you may be able to tune those technical skills within some sort of small-sided game. Or maybe you are coaching with players that come to soccer twice a week and that's all they do in terms of soccer. They don't even have a favorite team or watch games on the weekend. Well, that's a very different environment for you to get the players technically proficient as opposed to those players playing on the street. So really valid points from the on the fence guys. And of course, I kind of laugh and joke about them being on the fence, but they make some really good points for us. So in reflection, we've gone through this classic approach to developing a session from simple to complex, or unopposed to opposed, or a technical focus into a tactical focus. However you like to progress your session, that is what I would typically call this classic approach. It was the same approach that I experienced as a player, and it was the same approach that I would typically follow when I first started coaching. I believe that you will deliver in the same way you were taught. So that was something kind of that I expected. But something that Emily McMillan mentioned was that she has just gone through mid-season or mid-year evaluations with the players and gathers their feedback. And interestingly, one of the comments that she mentioned was that the players really like the foot skill portion of the practice. And I remember as a player going through this practice style and just knowing that you get to the end, you do what's asked of you, you get to the end, you get to play a game. And I wonder how many of your players are in the same position if you follow that same sort of structure, that they know exactly what's coming, so they go through the motions, they master the practice because that's what they need to do to get towards the game. So I didn't really hear of any other ways that people are introducing this idea of technical practices other than this traditional approach to going from technical through to tactical or unopposed to opposed. So that was a really interesting point, that if you do believe in that technical focus, there seems to be that traditional focus of practice as you move through the day or move through your hour, an hour and a half of practice. So I want to move into the guys that I call the no separations. And this is where I think coaching styles and methodologies will become a little different. And that starts with Ricky Salazar. And he mentions that the easy answer to him is rondos and positional games. So definitely small-sided games and phases of play if that's what you want to focus on. And of course, always refer to your own game model when you're thinking about what your practice focus needs to be. But he says that he cannot separate the tactical side from the technical side. So this is where we come into this no separation idea, that this sort of practice may just be a consistent game flow environment or a consistent small-sided game environment. So you're not separating the two, but I'm interested to know through all of this how you are then working through that technical focus, and if it's just a kind of a point of contention where you're mentioning, hey, you got to be better there, or is it a player or two players that you may pull out and work them through some sort of technical development. My friend Dan James with the Elite Soccer Institute mentioned that everything he does or we do in terms of his club is game realistic, so there's technical and tactical built in with pressure. There are times we pull players out of the session and work on individual needs in isolation / position specific, but can't think of a time when he trains everyone the same and teaching generalized technical work, which I also think is really interesting too, that if you're working with an age of player that is identified as and you may have different outlines in your club or in your own philosophies, that at a certain age, players should be classified as a certain type of player, as I answered recently in my interview with Bernard. But if you are teaching everybody, and I think it's relevant to the super young ages, that there is an overall technical development that you can give to all players, whether that's just simple levels of comfort on the ball or ability to manipulate the ball in certain ways and work on certain skills. And I recently played against a team where I think almost every single player pulled off a Maradona against us within the game. So very simple to see what they had been working on in the last couple of weeks. But it's an interesting approach with Dan, that not necessarily training everyone the same or teaching generalized technical work. Kelly Sims, she mentions, or she was very simple in her comment, and she wrote play, play, play. And I would agree with her on that, that the more you play, the more you're going to have experiential learning, the more you are working in the situation that's relevant to you and which we want you to develop. And that's my fear sometimes with too much isolation or unopposed / technical work, that we're moving away from what the game is actually meant to be for our players. And then Gavin Murphy mentioned that technique is unique and players are encouraged to play unstructured and find their own way technically, which again relates back to the play idea with Kelly, and then also back to this idea of a culture of the game, that people are out playing, they're out finding their own way with the ball at their feet. And I remember as an individual growing up and playing with my older cousin and playing at the park with the old guys back then, they were 18 and 19 years old, maybe even a little older, but I was only 11 or 12, and I remember getting hit with the ball because I tried to block a shot, which was a great idea, but I got hit with the ball and I had a mitre. We had a mitre soccer ball, and I had mitre printed on my leg in a bruise for about 3 days after that. And that to me, I learned real quick about blocking shots from the big strong guys, but then about being better with the ball and about how to avoid those situations with bigger, stronger guys or faster guys, or if I was faster. And I just learned to hone my technical ability in a way that helped me tactically too. And that's something that I think if we could get players playing more in that street style, you learn that I'm not necessarily avoiding the bigger, stronger guys, but I'm finding a way that's going to help me be successful instead of allowing them to be successful. And I'll often find that with my players, if they are a very one-dimensional player, so for example, speed is typical one dimension, that the ball, they want to play the ball to the same player over and over again. And a clever player, for example, will take 5 steps away from that speedy player. So they're not running 1v1, but they have a 5-yard head start where they can either intercept the ball or they can just cut the player off, shield the ball, and help their team build out from wherever they are on the field. Now, if I am learning back when I'd learned on the field with the older players, now I'm going to find another way to make my speed valuable. So I may check in or I'll find other ways. But what I'm saying is that my players, and most players, often have a certain skill, and then they become focused on that skill only. And the connection to the wider game and to this idea of figuring it out for yourself, I think is really important for players, and I don't think it's done enough. Gavin also kind of goes on to mention that he rarely works on isolated practices because of their lack of context. So again, much like what Dan said, if it's generalized technical work or the same for everyone, it's not necessarily relative. So my question for these guys and for you, if you are this idea of no separation and everything's combined into one, which it is anyway, but depending on your focus of really not identifying a single skill within a practice, but working through it in relation to the game. My question for you is, knowing that the culture of play has changed significantly for most cultures in the US and most cultures of players, how do you work on this technical side for the players? Because there's no doubt that it's important, and you can work through various periodization plans with your individuals. So if they're playing 11v11, there's a significant tactical focus as opposed to a 3v3 or a 4v4 periodization session where there is a significant technical demand on them. So there are plenty of apps out there, plenty of what I will call gimmicks. If you've ever been to the United Soccer Coach Convention, if you just go into the exhibition hall, you'll see the next generation of madness that's being sold, such as rondo rings and balls with chips in them that tell you how many times you've touched it and so on, which I think it may suit many of our players, but in reality, we're talking about context. As Gavin said, we're not really getting anywhere in terms of developing our players. And it also doesn't encourage them to become a better player. It's just another tool. Same as if you have a set of dumbbells in your garage, it doesn't mean you're going to become the world's strongest man or you're going to be able to lift real heavy. It just means that they're in there. You've got to have the desire and the motivation to do that. So how do you get that in there? How do you encourage your players to love it and to want to be a better player? It's not enough that I want you to be a better player, but how much do you want to be? And going back to my recent interview on the Touchline podcast, the question in there was about the culture of the game in the UK as opposed to how it is in the US. And one of my theories or one of my feelings is that here it's not a constant. How can you make a constant for your players? How much do you want to challenge them? How much do you ignite this passion in them to want to be a better soccer player? And that kind of leads me full circle to my own approach in that I use a lot of games within my practices. I very rarely follow the traditional approach of the simple to complex or the unopposed to opposed or the technical into tactical. I will often go through games and then I'll set homework and challenges and demands on players so that they are working in an environment that is demanding better of them, because if they are unable to control the ball, the game breaks down. And if the game breaks down, their team is not playing as good as they could. I use a lot of video feedback for players too. So if there are constants with players that are not controlling the ball or are making silly decisions or what I would deem as not so good decisions with the ball at their feet that I think could be improved technically or tactically, I will share that with them and I'll just send them a 5-second video and say, what do you think here? What do you think about this? And then when I see them again, it's a constant reflection of saying, do you remember that video? What about if you did this? Or what about if you did that? Or what have you been doing to improve on that? So there, again, it's that constant want for them to be better, and I'll challenge them. If they don't want to be, then they'll soon begin to tailor off, or we'll find them another place to play. But within the environment I'm in, there's a demand for them to want to be the best. Art Hernandez made a really good point, and this is what I'm calling the considerations portion. And one of them is that methodologies are changing. And Art mentioned that in the last 10 years, his own methodologies and his own approach has changed with influences, but then also he does a lot of individual training for players. So kind of one-on-one private training type stuff. And if you have any experience with that, you know that that is all technical stuff. There may be some tactical kind of turn and play into spaces and such, but for the most part, it's still underpinned by technical development. And so knowing that you are working with a player for 30 minutes to an hour, that's a long time with an individual that A, is hopefully motivated, but that challenges you as a coach to get in this technical development without constantly hammering on using the correct part of the foot, because then it becomes boring, it becomes mundane for the player because they're constantly being told what they're not doing right, which I really think is a good point from Art. And he mentions if you can, go and get the same experience. Go and put yourself in all these different environments where you're working with a small group, or you're working with older players, or you're working with a new coach, or you are working one-on-one with an 8-year-old, and you begin to increase and expand on your soccer toolbox. Again, back to US soccer, this idea of a toolbox, that all of these methodologies and all of these ways of learning and encouraging players to learn and creating soccer to be a constant in their life, then you have to have all these experiences that are going to help you. And it begins with doing what Bernard did with me in the last episode of asking questions and using your eyes and watching other people, or at least putting yourself out there. And maybe you'll earn a bit of money on the side too, but he then will also follow a typical pattern of a rondo into technical development, and then the US soccer methodology of orientation and learning, which is pretty much a game if you're doing it in the right space. So I thought it was a really interesting consideration. And then another consideration from Brad Creighton is that age is a factor too. Most of the people that I've mentioned earlier on are all working within the youth game. There are U9s, U11s, and 9s through 12s. And so Brad mentions that would you possibly reduce the technical focus after, say, age 13? And I think that's an interesting perspective too, because you would think that players at that level are likely to be playing because they want to be playing for high school, for college, and so on. So perhaps there's a valid point. And again, back to evaluating your environment. If you are surrounded by high school and college soccer, or even professional soccer, that's the pathway for those players, then hopefully, and I say hopefully, it should be a given that players are striving and continuously playing and wanting to do more. Perhaps you're training more times per week, so you can have an individual technical session if you really wanted to. But if you are still working in that lower level recreational, maybe some low level travel type soccer, I think technical is always going to be a point, because the culture of your player may not be that type of player that's going to be out playing all the time. Now, it can't be a good podcast to either stimulate ideas or to remind you of experiences that maybe had a value that you've forgotten about or have kind of changed track over time. And my roommate from my A license, Mr. Dave O'Neill, he in his comment mentioned that he spends very little time unopposed with the players. Plays all sorts of games that are ball manipulation and energizers for the players. There's all sorts of things like relays and sort of multiple levels of games that help players teach other players, which I think is a really valuable perspective too, that you can have a really good player work with another player on receiving or what they do in particular to help them receive the ball better. But then he talks about having quick hits of isolation during transition between activities. And that took me kind of full circle to a discussion I had and a session that I attended at the convention last year. And it was called, I think, interlearning. But in searching, I couldn't find the correct term for it, mainly because my Google was like a sentence, and Google doesn't really like searching for sentences. But the idea is that it's in a classroom setting, it would be classed as spacing out learning. So let me run you through what that may look like. So if today on my periodization plan was a fitness day would be 9 out of 10. So I'm going to ask my players to get to 9 out of 10 on, that's the hardest thing they had to do in that practice. Not the hardest thing ever, because you'll never achieve that, but 9 out of 10 for that day. That's a really stressful day for them. So I would do 5 rounds of 5-minute games with 1 minute rest in a 5v5, if that's my game size for the day. That should get the players to a 9 out of 10. If John Cohn's listening, maybe he'll disagree with that, but it's my session and I think I'm going to roll with it. So knowing that I need to get my players to a 9 out of 10, I will use the first 30 minutes of the practice. As soon as they arrive, they may play cuppies or something, but pretty much on the dot, we're starting. Now, I will play the same 5v5 game and break it down into longer periods of time with some intervals. Now, the idea is that I will use 5, 6, maybe even 7 or 8 minutes to allow for coaching stoppages of the same 5v5 game. And I'll use that to teach. So they will become familiar with the rules of the practice. They may have targets or goals or certain ways that they can score goals. They need to learn this to perform it successfully. So I'll use those first few, maybe 2 or 3 intervals to teach the players the practice and to coach them through it. Then, if I was playing, let's say I gave myself 30 minutes and that's 3 rounds of play, I would play for 7 minutes and have a 3-minute interval. In those 3-minute intervals, I'm going to remove the players from the small-sided games and take them to another part of the practice area and work through some sort of technical skill with them. It's completely removed from the 5v5 game. Or it's connected in a way that still has a focus. So if the 5v5 was to, part of it was to hit a 20-yard pass to connect with someone, then the isolation skill practice would incorporate something like a driven pass or a longer pass or some sort of passing pattern to help us achieve. So I would do that for 2 minutes, give them a minute off total. That would take me to 10 minutes. Then I do that another time and another time to fill the 30 minutes. So I have my watch running all the time. I'm on them constantly. So the demand is high. They're learning in those first 7 minutes. Now we're taking a portion of that, almost like a play, practice, play model, and I'm working on that with them. But it's called this spacing out learning, that I'm taking them away from that 5v5 challenging environment and giving them something different to focus on. Then when we return to it, the idea is that this task recall is being enhanced because they remember it. Oh, I remember this. And now they're remembering what they did or what they could do better from those first 7 minutes, and then they're back into it again. Now, the benefit to my periodization is that after this 30 minutes, we take a 2 or 3 minute water break. And now I know that they know, I've told them they need to hit a 9 out of 10. So now we go and play these 5v5s for 5 minutes with a minute rest. And they know the task. They've worked on both a technical development practice that is helping them, and they've also learned the rules of the 5v5. Now we can push to a 9 out of 10 that I don't necessarily have to be coaching in, but there's a focus of coaching, of course, but they are achieving the periodization, they're achieving technical development, and they're achieving a tactical development through those first 30 minutes of teaching. So I think this idea of spacing out requires a lot of planning. It requires a really good understanding of the connection between the tactical and technical components of your practice, much like many people are already doing in moving from unopposed to opposed. I love to create an environment that is challenging my students or my players to think first. So I want them to try and figure out the answer. I want them to struggle somewhat. And then the technical aspect that I'm bringing in the spacing out is just going to help them a little bit more. And there's a constant reference. Do you remember in the practice when? Do you remember in the 5v5 when? At what point in the 5v5 was this relative? So now they're beginning to build this foundation that they can take back. So when they have this task recall, they also have a bit more of a skill that can help them develop in that. Now, it's kind of complex, I guess. If you really think about it, it's 2 practices in one at first, and then we use the same practice again afterwards. So if you are working in small spaces, if you're unfortunate enough to only have a quarter of a field, or if you are working in a space where there's lots of people, or it's always different. Now, it's difficult to set up 2 practices where you're moving players around, and maybe you get shouted at for not using all the space because somebody else may want to use it. But if you can become economical with your cones and with your practice space, and you can even use the same space within and just add a cone or remove a cone, or however you do it, I strongly encourage you to consider this way of not only improving in the tactical understanding and even just the practice demand understanding for the players, but you can still pull in this technical development. And from my own perspective, I do not like the idea of unopposed to opposed or technical practices. I agree with Gavin, as he mentioned, it's out of context, but there is definitely a place for it. Now, if I can give them the game first and then give them these small bites of A, removal, but then B, just a little bit to push them and to encourage them more for success, I think that's the way that we need to go about it. Do I do it? Not enough, not nearly enough. And that's why I mentioned Dave's tweet specifically, because it just gave me this little recall on what I had started doing before, and then thinking, well, why don't I do that more? It makes a lot of sense for me on paper to challenge my players that way. So to get your hands on this brand new spacing out idea that I just implemented, hit me up on Lee Dunn Soccer. I will create a post on there. You can download it. I'll outline what a session would look like for you, just so you can see it in theory. And I'll add in some of the tactical pad stuff too, so you can see what it would look like. You can share it with your players. You can show yourself to help you understand, because I realize the benefit of tactical pad is exactly what I just spent the last 10 minutes explaining of how I would do it, and a simple GIF would help you understand and help your players understand it much more. So I will show you that over at leedunnsoccer.com. Thank you to all of the people that have taken part in this episode today. They make the Twitter world go round. They're all super good coaches that care about the individuals that they're working with, and that to me leads me down the road of saying there is no right answer, there is no wrong answer. There are always times where I can ask you questions, and I ask for your opinion, so I'm sharing your opinion and then giving my opinion on top of it. And if you have any queries, or if you feel like I've misrepresented you, I apologize, but hit me up, let me know, at @LeeDunSoccer on Twitter. Check me out on Instagram. I've talked about my wife's pictures before, but starting to grow more and more material on there too. So definitely check me out. There's more stuff coming this new year. I'm really excited to get through my A license now and be rolling forward. So look for more material coming from me real soon. Thank you so much.